In the foggy mountains of Western Virginia, where time seems to have stopped in the 1950s, there exists a city with the prophetic name of Odd. It is there, between dirt roads and huts forgotten by modernity, that the Whitaker family lives, the subject of one of the most disturbing documented stories about consanguinity in the United States. Ray Whitaker cannot speak. At 36, this slim man with a lost look communicates only through grunts and inaccurate gestures. His head is visibly smaller than normal, a medical characteristic known as microcephaly, and his eyes can never focus on the same point simultaneously. Recent documentaries revealed that Ray is the product of multiple generations of marriages between close relatives, a cycle that started with his great-grandparents and has perpetuated itself to this day. The house where Ray lives with his brothers is a reflection of the generations of neglect that mark this family. The wooden walls rot slowly while garbage accumulates in the yard where chickens vie for space with malnourished dogs. There is no functional running water and electricity comes through exposed wires that dangerously serve the precarious structures. Ray's medical records are virtually non-existent. Born at home like all the Whitakers, he has never received a formal diagnosis for his neurological conditions. The local, deeply religious and conservative community has always treated the family as an embarrassing secret, preferring to ignore its existence rather than confront the reality of decades of social neglect. Betty Whitaker, Ray's sister, can articulate some words, but her intellectual disability is evident. She walks in an uncoordinated manner and has severe difficulty with comprehension. According to researchers who studied the family, Betty and Ray are the children of parents who were first-degree cousins, whose own parents also had consanguineous relationships. Geographical isolation contributed to perpetuating this cycle. With only 79 inhabitants scattered through a hard-to-reach mountainous area, marriage options have always been limited. For decades, families like the Whitakers remained invisible to social services, creating whole generations of children with severe genetic deficiencies. The history of the Whitakers gained national attention only in 2020 when photographer Mark Leiter published a documentary about the family. The images shocked America. Adults with a childish appearance, communication limited to animal-like noises, and living conditions that challenge basic human dignity. Ray spends his days sitting on the porch of the house, watching the world with eyes that will never be able to completely process the reality around him. He does not understand that his condition is the result of choices made by previous generations, nor that his existence represents one of the darkest chapters of American social neglect. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Here you discover hidden stories of deep America that no one else shows. In the heart of Appalachia, where rural poverty intertwines with questionable ancestral traditions, a girl was born in 1992 that social workers identified only as Bethany in official reports. Her history, documented in the archives of Kentucky's Department of Social Services, reveals the devastating consequences when consanguinity becomes a practice normalized over generations. Bethany came into the world with spina bifida, a congenital malformation that left her spine exposed and caused permanent paralysis in her legs. Additionally, she was born with urinary and fecal incontinence, moderate hydrocephalus, and severe cognitive limitations that prevented her from developing basic skills such as articulated speech or recognition of family faces. Her parents, identified in the documents as Sarah and Billy Mackenzie, were first-degree cousins. Even more disturbing, her paternal and maternal grandparents also maintained direct kinship relations, creating a family tree that resembled more of a genetically deficient shrub. This concentration of similar genetic material had been accumulating for at least 4 generations, dramatically amplifying the chances of congenital malformations. Bethany's discovery by the authorities happened by chance in October 1997. A storm had damaged telephone lines in the region and electric company technicians had to access the Mackenzie property for repairs. What they found traumatized them: a 5-year-old, clearly malnourished, lying on a dirty mattress on the floor of a house without proper heating. Bethany had never attended school or received any kind of medical care. Her parents, both with obvious intellectual limitations, did not understand the severity of her condition. They fed her with leftover food and left her alone for hours while they worked on a small tobacco plantation that barely supported the family. The report from the social worker who first visited the house describes a desolate scene. The child remains motionless most of the time, communicates through low moans, and shows clear signs of prolonged neglect. The domestic environment is unhealthy with a strong odor of urine and feces. The caregivers show affection for the child but are unable to provide adequate care due to their own limitations. The local community had known the situation of the Mackenzie family for years. But a combination of geographical isolation, distrust of authorities, and the normalization of consanguinity in the region had created a pact of silence. Neighbors occasionally brought food to the family but never questioned the conditions of Bethany's life. When she was finally removed from the home and taken for medical evaluation, the results confirmed the experts' worst fears. In addition to visible malformations, Bethany had partial hearing impairment, congenital heart problems, and a level of cognitive development equivalent to that of an 18-month-old child, despite being 5 years old. Dr. Michael Harrison, a geneticist who examined Bethany at Louisville Children's Hospital, later stated, "This case represents one of the most extreme examples of endogamy I have ever documented. The chances of a child being born with so many simultaneous complications in a family without a history of consanguinity would be practically zero." Bethany was placed with an adoptive family specializing in the care of children with special needs. Her new caregivers reported small progress over the years. She learned to recognize family voices and developed a limited form of communication through gestures. However, her physical and cognitive limitations remained severe, requiring constant care for the rest of her life. On an isolated farm in East Texas, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched to the horizon, unfolded one of the most extreme cases of consanguinity and abuse ever documented in the United States. The story of Marcus, as he was identified in police reports, reveals how far degeneration can go when incest becomes systematic within a family. Marcus was born in 2000, the result of a relationship between a 45-year-old man and his own 16-year-old daughter. What made this case even more shocking was the discovery that this was not the first occurrence in the family. Later records revealed that the father had maintained sexual relations with at least 3 of his daughters over 2 decades, generating multiple children with severe genetic deficiencies. When authorities finally arrived at the property, they found Marcus locked in a tool shed, sleeping on old newspapers and feeding on scraps that someone occasionally left in a dog bowl. The 4-year-old had severe hydrocephalus, making his head disproportionately large in relation to his slight body, his eyes constantly watery due to intracranial pressure, could never focus properly. Marcus's total deafness had gone unnoticed by the family for years. They interpreted his lack of response as stubbornness or mental retardation without understanding that he simply could not hear. Additionally, congenital heart problems made any physical exertion leave the child breathless, dramatically limiting his mobility. Marcus's behavior also had worrying characteristics. According to reports from the first caregivers who attended to him, he showed episodes of inexplicable aggressiveness, biting and scratching anyone who tried to approach. Experts later identified these behaviors as possible symptoms of neurological damage caused by extreme consanguinity and the trauma of abandonment. The discovery of the case happened through an anonymous report made by a rural worker who occasionally provided services on the property. According to the worker's testimony, he had seen a child being locked in the shed and noticed that he never played outdoors like other children. The tip led the Texas Department of Family Services to begin an investigation that would reveal one of the most disturbing stories of family neglect ever recorded in the state. If you are feeling the weight of this story as I did, comment now. No one is born condemned. When officers entered the property with a search warrant, they found not only Marcus but evidence that other children had lived in similar conditions. Old photographs showed at least 2 other boys with physical characteristics similar to Marcus's. But these children had died in their first years of life, supposedly due to natural causes that were never properly investigated. Marcus's father, identified as Robert Earl Thompson, was arrested and later sentenced to life imprisonment for multiple charges of child sexual abuse and criminal neglect. During the trial, even more disturbing details emerged. Thompson had isolated his family from the outside world for more than 2 decades, forbidding his daughters from attending school or keeping in touch with people from outside the property. Marcus's medical evaluation revealed irreversible neurological damage. Beyond hydrocephalus and deafness, he had micrognathia, an underdeveloped lower jaw, swallowing problems that required feeding through a tube, and severe delays in motor development. His mental age was estimated at approximately 8 months despite being 4 years old. The state of Texas took over custody of Marcus, placing him in a specialized center for the care of children with complex medical needs. Caregivers reported that initially Marcus did not show typical emotional reactions. He did not smile, did not cry when injured, and seemed disconnected from the world around him. It took months of intensive care for him to begin to show basic signs of recognition and affection. Today, more than 2 decades later, Marcus remains under permanent institutional care. He never developed communication or basic independent skills, remaining in a state of total dependence. His history has become a case study used in genetic medicine and social work courses, illustrating the devastating consequences of extreme consanguinity combined with systematic family neglect. On the vast plains of North Dakota, where the wind cuts like a blade and winter extends for endless months, there exists a religious community that has maintained traditions for generations that the outside world would consider archaic. It was in this environment of deliberate isolation that twins were born in 2008 who would devastatingly illustrate how endogamy can even affect siblings born from the same womb. The New Harmony Colony, founded in 1952 by fundamentalist families seeking to live according to literal interpretations of the Bible, had developed over the decades a social structure that discouraged marriages with people outside the community. With only 180 inhabitants distributed among 30 families, marriage options were severely limited, resulting in decades of marriages between cousins and even between uncles and nieces. Rebecca and Alyssa Miller were born to parents who were first-degree cousins. Furthermore, both paternal and maternal grandparents also maintained close kinship, creating a genetic concentration that specialists would later characterize as catastrophic. While Rebecca was born seemingly healthy, developing normally in her first months of life, Alyssa came into the world with a condition so rare it initially confused even experienced doctors. Alyssa was born with Fraser syndrome, an extremely rare congenital malformation that occurs in approximately 1 in 200,000 births in populations with normal genetic diversity. In her case, the condition manifested in a particularly severe form. Her eyes were completely covered with skin, creating a smooth surface where eyelids should be. Additionally, she was born without external ears, with genital malformations, and breathing problems that required constant medical assistance. The reaction of the New Harmony community to Alyssa's condition revealed the depth of the beliefs that had shaped this isolated society for decades. Many colony members interpreted the child's birth as a divine punishment for unspecified sins, while others saw her condition as a test of faith sent by God. This theological perspective had devastating practical consequences. Alyssa was kept hidden from the view of external visitors and was never officially presented to the congregation. For the first 2 years of her life, Alyssa lived in a back room of the family home, cared for exclusively by her mother, Sarah Miller. The girl was never taken to Sunday services, did not participate in community meals, and her existence was known only by immediate family members and the colony's religious leaders. This social segregation began at birth and intensified as her medical needs became more evident. The discovery of Alyssa's situation by state authorities happened accidentally during a routine investigation into home education in the colony. In 2010, inspectors from the North Dakota Education Department visited New Harmony to check if the children were receiving adequate instruction as required by state law. During these visits, an inspector noticed medical records for 2 children born on the same date in the Miller family, but only Rebecca was presented. When asked about the second child, the parents initially claimed she had died in childbirth. However, inconsistencies in the medical documents led to a further investigation. Social workers eventually discovered Alyssa, then 2 years old, living in conditions they characterized as severe medical negligence. The girl was severely malnourished, weighing less than a 6-month-old baby, and showed signs of chronic respiratory infections that had never been treated properly. Her facial malformations had worsened due to the lack of early medical intervention, and she showed severe developmental delays that went beyond her congenital physical limitations. Dr. James Peterson, a specialist in craniofacial malformations at Minneapolis Children's Hospital who later examined Alyssa, described her condition as one of the more severe manifestations of Fraser syndrome I have ever encountered, aggravated by years of medical negligence. He explained that early surgical interventions could have significantly improved her quality of life, but the window for many of these procedures had closed due to the delay in treatment. Alyssa was immediately transferred to specialized medical care and placed under state custody. Multiple surgeries were performed in an attempt to improve her respiratory capacity and create functional eye openings, but the results were limited due to the extent of her malformations and the lost time in those crucial early years of development. Currently, Alyssa lives in an institution specializing in the care of children with complex medical needs. She never developed functional vision or verbal communication skills, depending fully on caregivers for all basic activities. Her history illustrates not only the genetic consequences of consanguinity but also how extreme religious beliefs can aggravate already desperate situations. Rebecca, her twin sister, remained with her biological family but under the strict supervision of social services. Now a teenager, she has developed normally, serving as a painful contrast to the fate that awaited her sister from birth. Cape Girardeau Regional Hospital in Missouri was not prepared for what arrived at its doors on a cold December morning in 2015. A young woman appearing to be between 20 and 25 years old staggered into the emergency room carrying a baby wrapped in dirty rags. She left the child on a chair in the waiting room and disappeared before any employee could question her. What followed revealed one of the most disturbing stories of multi-generational consanguinity ever documented in the American Midwest. The baby, a girl of approximately 6 months, showed immediate signs of severe neglect and congenital malformations. Her head was visibly smaller than normal, a medical characteristic known as microcephaly, and she weighed only 4.5 pounds, a typical weight for a newborn. Even more alarming, she was born completely without teeth, an extremely rare condition called anodontia, which in babies can indicate profound genetic problems. The medical team that first examined the child was shocked by the extent of her medical needs. In addition to microcephaly and anodontia, she had severe swallowing problems that prevented her from feeding normally, malformations in the palate that affected her breathing, and clear signs of severe neurological delay. Her eyes, although anatomically normal, showed no ability to focus or follow objects, suggesting possible damage to the central nervous system. An investigation into the child's identity led authorities to discover a complex network of rural families in southeastern Missouri who had practiced consanguinity for at least 5 generations. Through DNA analysis and genealogical research, it was determined that the baby was a product of multiple layers of endogamy. Her parents were half-siblings. Her grandparents were first-degree cousins, and her great-grandparents also maintained direct kinship relations. Cape Girardeau County Sheriff Marcus Williams described the investigation as one of the most disturbing of my 25-year career in law enforcement. The search for the child's mother led investigators to a network of isolated rural properties where multiple families with interchangeable surnames lived in conditions of extreme poverty, maintaining a cycle of consanguinity that had become normalized over decades. Fragmentary records suggested that the baby's mother, identified only as Crystal, was herself a product of consanguinity and presented severe intellectual limitations. Witnesses reported that she had become pregnant at 16 by a man who could have been her half-brother or close cousin, but paternity was never definitively determined due to the complexity of family relationships and the family's refusal to cooperate with authorities. Crystal and the child's alleged father had fled the region weeks before the baby was abandoned, leaving behind a trail of clues that revealed the extent of neglect the child had suffered from birth. Neighbors reported hearing constant crying coming from the property where they lived, but no one had intervened due to a combination of fear, distrust of authorities, and the normalization of family dysfunction in the local community. The baby's full medical evaluation revealed damage that went far beyond visible malformations. Neurological examination showed severely compromised brain development, with some areas of the brain underdeveloped or completely absent. Her hearing capacity was limited, and reflex tests indicated possible damage to the spinal cord that would permanently affect her mobility. Dr. Amanda Foster, a geneticist at St. Louis Children's Hospital who consulted on the case, explained that the levels of consanguinity necessary to produce so many simultaneous anomalies are extraordinary. This child represents what happens when multiple generations of endogamy accumulate without any genetic diversity introduced into the family pool. Since the child had been abandoned without a name or documentation, the hospital team decided to call her Hope. This name reflected not only the caregiver's desire that her condition might improve but also the hope that her story could serve as a warning to prevent similar cases in the future. Hope remained in the hospital for 8 months while authorities tried to locate willing and able family members to care for her. During this period, she underwent multiple surgeries to correct respiratory and feeding problems, but her prognosis remained guarded. Neurologists determined she would never develop cognitive skills beyond the level of a few-month-old baby. The state of Missouri took over Hope's permanent custody, placing her in a home specializing in the care of children with complex medical needs. Today, at 9 years old, she remains in a state of total dependence, requiring feeding through a tube, respiratory assistance at night, and constant medical care. She never learned to sit without support, did not develop communication skills, and has frequent seizures that require continuous medication. Hope's story has become a case studied in medical schools and social service programs across the country. Her case illustrates not only the devastating genetic consequences of prolonged consanguinity but also how rural poverty, social isolation, and systemic neglect can create conditions where such tragedies are perpetuated for generations. Attempts to locate Crystal and the child's father continued for years, but they were never found. They are believed to have left Missouri, possibly moving to other isolated rural communities where they could continue to live on the fringes of society. The possibility that they have had other children in similar conditions remains a constant concern for local authorities. Hope's case also revealed significant gaps in the rural child protection system. Many of the families involved in the consanguinity network had lived for decades without regular contact with social services, formal education, or preventive medical care. This social invisibility created an environment where harmful practices could continue without external intervention. Nurses and caregivers who work with Hope report that despite her severe limitations, she occasionally demonstrates signs of consciousness that are deeply moving. She can recognize familiar voices and occasionally produces sounds that suggest attempts to communicate. These moments, though rare, remind all involved that behind the medical statistics, there is a real person whose potential was irreversibly limited by decisions made generations before her birth. Hope's story serves as a dark reminder that even in the 21st century, practices most consider relics of the past continue to occur in isolated pockets of rural America. Her case highlights the need for continuous surveillance, community education, and proactive intervention to protect vulnerable children who may be living in similar conditions in other parts of the country. Today, Hope is still cared for with dedication by a medical team that treats her with dignity and respect despite her limitations. Her history, although tragic, contributed to changes in child protection policies in Missouri and served as a catalyst for greater awareness of the dangers of consanguinity in isolated communities. If you have watched this far, it is because you appreciated this story. Leave a comment saying I watched here so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Like this video to help give visibility to forgotten stories like these, and share it with those you think should know about these cases that America prefers to forget.